This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. And for our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. In this episode of The Biggest Table, I interview Sarah Westfall, a writer, speaker, and host of the Human Together podcast, who recently published her book, The Way of Belonging. We discuss themes of hospitality, belonging, and experiencing God's love through food and community. Sarah shares her personal journey of belonging from her uncomplicated childhood to the complexities of adulthood and the significance of shifting the question from where do I belong to how can I be a place of welcome. We explore the importance of internal spiritual work, societal pressures affecting belonging, and the practice of hospitality in daily life. Sarah emphasizes the role of curiosity, imagination, and genuine human connection in fostering belonging. The conversation concludes with practical insights into living out hospitality and addresses listeners who may feel stuck or lonely, reminding them of God's ever-present welcome. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. Today, I'm joined by Sarah Westfall. Sarah is a writer, speaker, and host of the Human Together podcast. Her book, The Way of Belonging, Reimagining Who We Are and How We Relate, is a spiritual narrative that invites us to put down the exhausting search for acceptance and approach belonging as a way of being. A divine welcome that is already ours to embrace and to extend right where we are. Her previous work includes serving as director of community for online writing groups and as a student development professional on college campuses. Sarah lives in Indiana with her husband, Ben, and 4 sons. So thanks for joining me today, Sarah. It's great to connect.
Yeah, Andrew, it's so good to be here with you.
No, and really enjoyed your book on the way of belonging. And when I saw it was coming out from IVP, I was just excited, just thinking through hospitality and belonging. So I'm excited to explore these themes with you and how it relates to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I know when you're in your intro and you were talking about hospitality and food, I'm like, oh, you're speaking my language right now.
Yeah, awesome. So, and as we get started, I'm just curious for myself and for our listeners, like, what's your story of belonging, and how did that story inform how you wrote this book?
Yeah. I think belonging is a question that I have carried within my person for a really long time. I was actually just over the weekend at my mom's house looking back through some old photos, helping her sort through these boxes of photos. And there's a series of them from when I was like probably 6 or 7. We grew up on a street in which all the neighborhood kids were out. Our backyard was kind of all an extension of each other's backyards. And I think back to that time, it was probably the time when belonging felt the least complicated
Right. Yeah.
in my life, because if you felt lonely, you just kind of went next door and knocked on, Emily's door and said, hey, do you want to come out and play? If she said no, you just went to the next door and kind of kept going. You didn't think too much about it, or at least I didn't. But as I moved into the school age years, especially in later elementary, middle school, especially in high school, as these questions of who am I, of identity, of wanting to fit in began to surface, and you kind of collect relational wounds along the way. Those things kind of compiled, and belonging then became much more complicated for me. And I began to ask the question, or to seek out the answer to that question of how do I belong? Where do I fit in? Really through acceptance and through achievement. I traded the spotlight for like the few moments in the spotlight for really being known. And being seen is not the same as being known.
No.
And so for me, it's been a long journey of this question that I have carried, and finding different ways to answer it, and to reshape my approach to belonging especially over the last decade. I feel like that the way that I've pursued belonging has shifted from when I was younger. And I'll be honest, it's a question I still carry because I continue to grow and change as a human, and my relationships and places and people continue to shift. And so it's a question I'll continue to explore as well.
No, I love that. Yeah, because in some ways we want to arrive at belonging and just find that safety and security. But if we're honest, because of the mobility of today's society, a friend is here one moment and gone the next. And so belonging, I think, is always shifting and given stages of life, and, you know, from kids to marriage to empty nesting, it's always a work in progress.
It is. And I think of it even in the context of my most intimate and trust-filled relationships, like my own husband. My sense of belonging, even with him, the person with whom I can be the most myself, with whom I feel the most at home, it can still shift based on where we are in our marriage or where we are as individuals. And so many factors play into that. And I think one of the graces that I have discovered along the way is letting it shift. Like you said, not thinking of it as this like concrete place of arrival, but as this thing that kind of ebbs and flows, and we can let it, and just acknowledge that that there's pliability in it.
I love that word, that pliability of belonging. And you mentioned, excuse me, sort of in the beginning of your book that your quest for belonging sort of shifted as the question shifted. You changed your question from what does it look like to belong to how can I be a place of welcome? And so what's that shift, and why is that shift important as we think about belonging?
Yeah. I think the question, but especially back in my teens and in my 20s, I think when I was asking the question of where do I belong, I was really asking the question, who am I, and am I loved?
Yeah.
And that question is not exactly the same as my belong. It's related to belonging, because it's this question of who am I? Am I wanted here? Am I welcomed here, in this space? And for me, the shift came because I think that's still an important question. I think it still matters. Our relationships with other people and the places where we ourselves feel welcomed and invited, that are safe, that invite us to be whole and known. But I think that's only like part of the equation when it comes to belonging. I read Henry Nouwen's book, The Return of the Prodigal Son. And I was so familiar with that story, having grown up in church. Most of us identified maybe with one son or the other. I was the older brother personally,
right?
Because I am an oldest. I'm a high achiever. I kind of allowed my worth and my work to get wrapped up in each other. And so it was really easy for me to see myself in that story. But what Henry Nouwen did in that book that kind of shifted the question of belonging for me was that he said, while we might see ourselves in one son or the other, what God continually invites us into and what he demonstrates kind of as the father figure in that story is this abundance of welcome. And so the invitation then to us is not only to come home to the Father, to say, I am already loved. This is who I am. But then to allow us to continue to be formed into people who extend that same welcome, that same sense of home in the world. And I think that is the continuing invitation to us. And for me, it really helped me to stop caving in on myself in these moments when I felt like I just didn't fit, And I got really self-focused in that, or I wanted to pull back from people, from places, from relationships. And instead, by shifting my focus to how I can step into a room and extend welcome, honestly has been so much more freeing. It's like an exhale of, I'm not just waiting around for people to want me, that I can then be the kind of person who extends that welcome.
Right.
And so there's definitely, long-term in relationships, there has to be that reciprocity.
Yeah.
In order for trust to grow over time. But I think that for me, just that shift of allowing myself to become the kind of person that extends welcome, when I go to the grocery store or when I'm at the kids' school, and to have that change of focus has helped me not feel like I carry so much lack when I walk into a room.
Interesting. Yeah. But in order to do that, that's a hard work that we have to internalize, God's welcome towards us, that even if we identify as the elder brother, the father, as you point out and helped me understand, the father still searches for the elder son. He's not just searching for the younger son. He goes out and searches for the elder son. And so how, and you also in your book are clear that this isn't a 5-step program to becoming a person of belonging, but there are postures we can take. And so how do we begin to internalize that welcome of Jesus that then helps us to be a welcoming presence?
Yeah. It's funny. I think when we think about belonging, we often think of our external relationships with other people, and that's certainly part of the equation. But when we think about embracing this posture of welcome in the world and becoming more settled in who we are with God in our day-to-day lives, that is largely internal. That is internal work, and being able to step back from the very hectic nature of our everyday lives and pay attention to our internal landscape, of paying attention to what is happening within us and being able to know and to name those things. And so, I think you alluded to this earlier, that there is a lot of internal work that continues to happen as we pursue belonging in our day-to-day lives. And so for me, that looks like needing to carve out some time for reflection. Now, some days that's like 5 minutes.
Right. Yes.
It's not necessarily super long and extensive and intense. And sometimes it's just like the nature of how when you are like shopping for a new car or a new home, suddenly you begin to see that particular brand of car everywhere, and you're like looking and you're noticing. I think the same is true of when we are trying to pay attention to our internal landscapes. The more that we begin to pay attention, the more that it kind of becomes more natural, or our we're like those feelers are out. So it becomes more natural as we go, even if it feels kind of awkward at first. So it becomes part of more of just the cadence of our days and how we view the world. And so this posture of embracing the God who comes after us again and again and again, who invites us for, as C.S. Lewis says, farther up and further in.
Yeah.
I think it does begin with seeing ourselves the way that God sees us. And for me, that is a continual work, because I will continue to default to false versions of myself. I will continue to not want to see certain aspects of who I am.
Yeah.
I will want to, hide from those things. Humans have been hiding since the very beginning.
Right. Yes.
And so we continue to do that, even try from ourselves sometimes, let alone God and each other. And so this is continual work, is continuing to take a look at what is happening within us. Do we really believe we are loved?
Right.
Fully, wholly, where we are, from the Father who comes to find us. And not in a shame-inducing way, but in a way that let's name what is really happening within us. Let's really name who we think God is, and who, what, like the dialogue, the narrative that we believe about ourselves, and being honest about those things. Maybe sometimes that's our own work. Maybe sometimes that's alongside a spiritual director or a counselor or a trusted friend. But then I think some of the other things, like once we are kind of knowing and naming what is happening within us, also knowing and naming the narratives that we have with the other people that we're interacting with.
Right.
We all kind of have some defaults that we fall back into. People who are easier to get along with than others. You find out a certain detail about someone, and automatically there can be assumptions that come with that.
Yep.
And so being people who pursue the wider story, who seek to understand and not lose sight of the humanity of one another in the process. And then naming that narrative that's happening within us, I think, is really, really important in interacting with each other and becoming people who truly are welcoming to all. Because I think we want, like, if somebody were to ask me, like, oh, are you a welcoming person? I want to say really quickly, flippantly, well, of course. Like, I'm not going to be nasty to someone, but if I really take time to do some of the work, I begin to notice hesitations within myself. I begin to notice some preconceived ideas and stories that I've been telling about certain people. And that in of itself, again, is not a place of shame, but it's an invitation then for you to kind of lay it out before God and say, okay, what are we going to do with this?
Right.
And so, I think it really does begin with a lot of internal work.
For sure.
And may not begin, because again, like you said, it's not a 5-step program. We might have to like do some internal work and then begin to like reach out and develop trust and transparent relationships with people. And then something might happen and we're like, oh, there's more internal work to do.
Right. Yes, for sure.
It's a both and, but
no, and we can't wait for us to be settled in God's love before we try to extend it. But like you said, it's this testing and growing. Like, you grow and you put some feelers out there and see what's working or not working. And I don't even know if that's the right language. But yeah, like you said, it's a growth process. It's the pliability of belonging. But there are also there's a lot of internal work that needs to happen, but there's societal pressures also that prevent belonging. And I think I'm Captain Obvious in saying that, because we're inundated with it. We're coming up on, so much news in the new year that's going to reinforce or make us not feel like we belong. And so as you thought about belonging, what were some of those societal issues that you're like, hey, we need to wrestle through this on a bigger scale than just the internal work?
Yeah. I think, there's just, there are a lot of things that weigh heavily on me, especially when it comes to belonging. Because I think that we live in a moment where I won't say that we completely lack curiosity and imagination, but I don't think it's as high of a priority. And when we lack curiosity and imagination for what things could be, or for what God promises will be, or even keeping sight of his original creation, keeping that in mind, it's really easy for us to fall back into our corners. I mean, as human people, it's really easy to kind of drift toward what is familiar. We're experiencing it right now a little bit. Our family is trying to navigate where our church community is locally. And as we're visiting some of these different spiritual communities, these churches, we're processing with our kids, and they're like, well, I don't like it. I don't feel like I belong here. And we're having to like unpack that language. Well, what do you mean? Is it because you don't know anybody yet? Is it because it's not familiar?
Right. Yeah.
And that's a huge part of it. We tend to gravitate toward what is familiar and what is known, what is comfortable. But in the process, it becomes much more difficult to be curious, to listen, to realize there are people who have experiences far different from our own. And without curiosity, we're not going to understand how they arrived at a certain conclusion based on the experiences that they've had.
Right.
And so, when I think of belonging and when I think of being human together, I would love, even just for myself, I pray and I hope that we can be people who are quicker to curiosity about one another rather than to assumptions, to bias.
Yeah.
I also recognize that there are some deep wounds. Whether we're talking about the church, whether we're talking about politics, whether we're talking about, there's so many things that people have experienced serious wounds. And so when it comes to belonging, I think part of that internal work, part of that work we have to do with each other is asking, how can we move toward healing?
Yeah.
How can we move toward tender, compassionate care for ourselves and for each other? And I just, I don't know how specific you want to get, but I just think in general, like those are some of the things that continue to kind of grieve me. And I think the other thing that I would love to see, and there's not like a complete lack of this, but I think it is so easy even within myself to be able to call out what is wrong. I want to have more of us beginning to reach for and look at a vision for what could be. And because we need people who are saying, hey, these are the things that need fixed. But I feel like we also equally need people who are saying, what if, what could it be? How where do we go from here? And in a not necessarily just in a like silver linings kind of way, but let's get a vision beyond the maybe cynicism we have right now.
Yeah. No, and I love that because you and I were both raised in the evangelical culture where truth telling of our past wasn't always there per se. And so we're in this moment where people we're having to reckon with the hurt, the pain. And that's good. But like you said, we need to also then have a lot of us feel stuck of like, okay, we see the truth and we don't like where we are, but we don't know what's next. And I think that's where curiosity comes in. Because as I was reading, your book and thinking through it, and you talk about the fundamental attribution error and how we're quick to paint a story of somebody, like in a moment of honesty, like there's a person, we have a house on our street and the house always has these 2 huge trucks lifted, big tires, a few inappropriate bumper stickers, and so I automatically have a picture of who those people are without ever talking to them.
Right.
without ever even saying hi to them yet. Um, and so that prevents me like from even engaging them. Like, in my mind, I know exactly who they are already, so I just don't need to engage, which is so not the gospel and not what we need.
Yeah.
Um, but and so it's just that we live in that tension of like we see certain things and we're automatically attributing to certain things to those people without ever inviting curiosity of ourselves of like, okay, who might that person be? Um, and what might they be able to offer the
Yeah.
community, in wholesome ways that I'm preventing because I'm quick to attribute something that's probably not true to them.
Right. And I have to too in those moments, like remind myself, like they are equally loved by God and
Right.
contain just as much of his image as
Yes.
I do.
Right.
And so then being able to say, okay, well, what is that part of God that they reflect?
Hmm.
What might um what might I learn about God and about being human through that person? And sometimes it is like if we get the opportunity to actually like, you know, in non-weird ways,
Right.
get to know our neighbors and get to know more of their stories, um, and to begin to broaden the story that we've been telling ourselves about a particular person, then that's amazing. But I think sometimes, and this is where the imagination comes in, it's even just giving ourselves permission for other possibilities
Yeah.
of
Mm.
who they might be and and or what experiences might have shaped them. Um, because what that does in us, if anything, is at least soften us toward the
Mm.
humanity in
Right.
one another. It
Mm.
keeps us open. It keeps us from putting up these walls around ourselves, that might make us feel comfortable and safe, but they also keep people out.
Right. Yeah. Because studies have shown that when we silo and actually just homogenize our group of belonging, we actually don't, it doesn't foster belonging. That
Right.
belonging's fostered in multiplicity and diversity, in recognizing the uniqueness of that. Um,
Right. Well, and I think because what happens is when we have these silos and there are these like certain expectations or certain characteristics that are required in order to be part of that group, there builds up this anxiety
mm,
within us because, oh my goodness, what if I begin to deviate from
yeah.
these norms? Can I even say anything? Can I speak it to anyone? Um, whatever that might be.
Hmm.
And you're totally right. Like that's not belonging. That's fitting in. That
Right.
is acceptance. That
Yeah.
is um very narrow, um that's like groupthink at
Hmm.
its worst. And
Yeah.
belonging is just much more steady. It's
Mm,
sturdier.
mm,
It's so much more substantial than that. Um and yes, it kind of has an ebb and flow, but I don't think there's a sense with belonging that the longer we walk this way of belonging and recognize that it's actually a way of being in the world, the more I'm finding that um, it's becoming more natural to be connected with that welcome that God has already placed within me um, as a human person, as a person who has His image, His essence within me, and it feels less shaken
right.
by external situations. Now I'm still
Mm,
human.
yeah.
Wounds
Right.
still hurt.
Yeah.
Um, I still have certain people that I feel like there's a teenager in me still saying, "Can you please pick me? Can I
Right.
please be one of the cool kids?
Yeah.
Like,
Yes. Right.
please notice me."
Right.
Um, but there's also a growing steadiness that
Hmm.
seems, as I get older, a little less shakable
Right.
than it used to be.
Yeah. Yeah. No, as you were talking about it, and like the steadiness of belonging, like when we silo, it feels more concrete and it feels more steady, but all of our energy is spent holding that together. Whereas, when we approach life through this lens of belonging, it's grander, it's wider, it's more open space, but it's much more sure. If we can root ourselves in this belonging of Jesus.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's scary, because we never know where these wide open spaces may lead us. But like you said, there's a deeper foundation, I think, that we can walk in.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like the difference between like silo in a silo, I find myself eventually kind of holding my breath. Whereas when belonging has a much wider definition, there's exhale there. There is like, okay, like I can do this.
Right.
And not that it doesn't come without cost sometimes.
Right.
Because there will remain groups, maybe family members, maybe friends, maybe even churches or other types of communities that really want to cling to a very specific and narrow definition of what's required to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So there is grief in that.
Yeah.
There is letting go in that when we choose to widen that definition of belonging and say, I think it's bigger than that, and I think it's sturdier than that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still complicated.
It is. No, right. It's very complicated. And because like you said, there will still be hurt. This isn't just a, easy peasy lemon squeezy vision of life that's just, further up and further to the right.
Right.
But, the deep soul work takes time. It takes energy, it takes grief. And then when we extend ourselves to others, we're not to be doormats, but have good boundaries still, and prevent harm from coming into our families or our circles of belonging. But that will require hurt and grief as well.
Right.
Or there will be grief when friends move away, or belonging changes. But that's the risk I have to be willing to take. But to shift this, then because belonging, there's a hospitality that is entwined with this. And so as you've thought about belonging, like what has shifted for you for as you practice hospitality in with 4 boys in chaos, I'm sure reign supreme sometimes in your house. Like, what does hospitality look like for your family?
Yeah. I think it first and foremost for me does look like, what does this look like for my 4 boys? Like what do they experience within our home? And it is a lot of chaos. I'd be the first to admit that. That's why I take a bubble bath every night to kind of like, get my nervous system to kind of calm down a little bit. Yeah. But so it does begin with my boys of wanting them to experience the love and the welcome of God here in our home. We are not people who throw like lavish parties and or have a lot of when we have people over, it's a lot of paper plates and a lot of pizza or tacos. Yep. Whatever is easy. But when it comes to hospitality with people who live outside our home, it's on one hand, my husband and I are both introverts. And so it kind of is a struggle sometimes to invite people over and to have them in. But we also deeply enjoy it when they're here. Right. And we try to keep, we have a lot of family nearby. So we do have a lot of family in and out of our house fairly often. I mean, my sister's going to be here in about an hour with her girls to go sledding on the back hill. So, so I think for us, it's really just kind of inviting people to kind of just step into, here's our home and here's our life, and come join us for a little bit. We apologize for the noise. We'll send the kids to the basement, Right. But just inviting them to be part of that. It has also looked like for me, because I am an introvert and just the nature of having 4 kids, we try to keep a very slow paced life, but with 4 kids, it's like it takes a lot of effort to do that.
Yeah.
And so we try to keep our schedule with some margin in it.
Yeah.
And so for me, then my kind of regular point of connection with some of my friends locally, we do a supper club, and so we meet together once a month. Somebody brings 2 or 3 questions to the table. One person kind of plans the meal and says, "Okay, you bring a salad, you bring bread," that kind of thing. And we gather together in that way. And we're going on 5 years now together.
Very cool.
And it's been one of those relationships and places that has developed. It's like that equation of trust plus transparency over time, and just allowing it kind of like a tea to just steep very slowly. And as it has done that, it's become so rich and substantial, and a group of women that I know that I can reach out to and text anytime. And so allowing relationships to kind of develop in that way.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently regarding hospitality, because I don't think belonging is fully dependent on place and people, but I've been asking myself the question of what does it look like, though, to be hospitable to the places and people right where I am? What does it look like? What does it mean to have like that posture of hospitality as I move throughout the world?
Right.
That of wanting to invite in and to make people feel at home and at ease, and to share in moments together.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, that's also comes with attentiveness, of paying attention to and being able to both receive and to share in any given moment of life.
Right.
And that kind of changes the nature then. Like that really holds hands for me with belonging, because I feel like the more that I do that, the more I do feel deeply connected to a place. The more I do feel deeply connected to the people who I see it just commonplace at the library or at the at the gym or whatever it might be. Belonging grows out of that. The sense of belonging grows out of that, I think.
Yeah. No, and
yeah.
As you were talking, I love Henry Nouwen's definition of hospitality from Reaching Out, where he says that the hospitality is the creation of a free space where the stranger can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. Hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. And so as I was preparing for this, I was reminded of that quote of like, okay, hospitality isn't confined to people in place, but it's this way of being in the world where, like you said, you can invite somebody in, and they can feel the freedom to be them. And it's not about confining them and restricting them, but rather, how do we allow them to flourish in the world?
Yeah. I love that definition. I actually hadn't heard it before. You said it's from Reaching Out?
From Reaching Out, yeah.
Okay.
It's one of my favorite Henry Nouwen books just because of the hospitality aspect. And he has some great insight.
As he usually does.
Yes. Right, exactly, yes. How do we then, because hospitality, we usually think of hospitality as bringing people into our circles, but we're also invited into other people's circles. And so how do we take that belonging as a guest into circles where we're invited into, where it's not coercive, but we're not always the host, but we can be a guest? And so is there a difference, or is there a nuance, or is it all one and the same for you? Like,
I think it all comes back for me continuing to embrace that posture of welcome, to ask the question of what does it look like to embody welcome here and now in this space. And for me, because I am an introvert, it takes a little bit more like energy for me
Right.
to step into somebody else's space than it is to sometimes to invite people in or just to interact right where I am. And so, even today, Andrew, before I got on this podcast, something that I have to do before I step into a new space or with a new person is that I have to just take a moment and say, God, help me be a person of welcome here. Help me not to cave in on myself and to be so self-consumed with what others are thinking of me. Help me to look outward, to embody welcome even here. And it's not to say then I always do it really great and it pans out, but that moment of recognition before I enter a space that I've been invited into, before I enter a space that maybe I'm a little nervous about, helps me to just have that moment of groundedness and remember who I am, to remember who God is, and to remember that goes with me into the room.
I really love that exercise of just taking that moment of like, before we enter a space, whether it's for the first time or the 100th time, of how can I be a person of welcome? And how can I bring my true self into this? Because like you said, doing a podcast, like, it's a weird thing. Like we met just for the first time, I've read your book, so I know a little about you, but you know nothing about me. And I find myself wrestling with like, as I think about the podcast and guests, like not treating people as a commodity, that could further my, platform, but like, okay, how can I genuinely be curious, and just enjoy the conversation for what it is?
Right.
It's all intertwined in a mess, and we're all just a work in progress.
Right. Well, that honesty is so key because, we could turn being a person of welcome into just another thing to do. Like we have this vision in our head of what that might look like. And having to be honest with ourselves of saying, okay, these are the things that are floating around within me. This is what I see in my inner landscape here. And allowing ourselves when we take that pause and to say like, help me to be this person of welcome, let it flow from a genuine place, not like a synthetic, like I'm going to have this shiny smile now and be real super like exuberant with whoever I talk, whatever that looks like, because I think for me, my deepest prayer with all of this is that it would, we call the book The Way of Belonging because it is a way of being. It embraces the specificity of who we are and what we bring into the world, into the room, and becoming more settled in those things. But then also it becomes a way of allowing that to move us closer to God and to each other. And just very, this word might be overused, but like organic, very natural ways that it doesn't have to look welcome might look different for you than it does for me.
No, for sure. And I love that. And there will be seasons where we don't feel welcome or we feel lonely, where we feel betrayed. And so some people may be listening and have this way of belonging and it feels exciting and, like, okay, this is a new way of being and I can do this, or I can take a small step today to be a better person of belonging. But like, there'll be other people listening who might be like, I'm stuck, and it may not be, if you're depressed, like, and there's clinical issues you need to face those, like, but I'm also talking about people that are just in a stage of life where belonging just feels unattainable. Like, what would you say to those people who feel that immense sense of lack?
Yeah. Two things that come to mind for me is one, when it comes especially to belonging, but really any of our longings, what I want to take that sense of lack and let's reframe it. Instead of seeing it as a personal deficiency, what if we see it actually as a holy longing?
Hmm.
The desire to have people who know us and who we are connected with and who we trust and feel safe with. That is a good and holy longing because we are communal creatures.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that is like a longing is supposed to lead us in a good direction, in a God direction,
Mm-hmm.
to step one step closer to home. And so first, let's like maybe use a different word. Instead of you're carrying lack, you're carrying a longing.
Hmm.
The other thing that comes to mind, and this is really personal to me, is the story of Hagar from Genesis 16. Hagar, we don't know a ton about her other than she was an Egyptian slave girl of Abraham. She was badly treated by Abraham and Sarah and kind of, tried to escape out into the desert, pregnant, alone, didn't really know where she was going. And in that moment of desperation, when she felt like she belonged, didn't matter to anyone,
Mm-hmm.
God met her in that place. God met her in that wilderness. And she named him Elroy, which means the God who sees me.
Hmm.
And in that moment, I identify with her because I've had these moments. Not all the details of her story do I identify with, but I identify with that feeling of feeling like I am unseen and do not matter to anyone.
Right. Yeah.
And remembering that even there, that the enoughness of God, the withness of God meets us in those moments, and that we are seen intimately, fully. Like that matters. I mean, and for me, it matters so much that I have that name of God tattooed on my arm.
Yeah.
So, because it's something I need to like be reminded of daily. But I think as hard as it is and as horrible as it feels in those wilderness, lonely, hurt, wounded moments, the joy that I think, the possibility that exists there is in finding that God is still enough and that he is still there, even if we don't feel it. And I think my hope, my tentative prayer would just be that for somebody who finds themselves in that is to really cry out to God, and just continue to tell him where you're at.
Right.
I heard our pastor at a church that we were at a couple weeks ago of just talked about the spiritual practice of prayer is so often just is reaching out to God. It's this continual reaching. Like this is a huge faith thing that we can do, especially when we feel more absence than presence.
Right.
But I don't know. I trust in the faithfulness of God and in his timing. And I don't want to say that in a like really sugary kind of way, but from my own experience, when I have felt unseen, unheard, at the end of myself, I have found God to still be there.
Right. That's beautiful. Because whether we're the prodigal son or the eldest son, whether we feel like we've messed everything up or always played by the rules and done everything right, like the Father still comes looking.
Yeah.
And the Bible is just one story of God reaching out and looking for his people, and seeing us in our distress like Hagar. So yeah, no, and it's not easy to be in those places, but to trust that maybe, just maybe, God still sees us. And that's the only hope we can cling to. Like, okay, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, it's like in those moments where I've been like blatantly desperate before God, I think that I've emerged from those moments exhausted, but also I begin to perceive even little things differently. That it may not be that something grand has changed in my situation, but I begin to perceive little things as these kindnesses
Right.
from God.
Yeah.
And I think those little things really, really matter.
They do. Yeah.
I think he hovers in those a lot more than we realize most days.
Oh, I love that. Just, yeah, remembering those little kindnesses that are shown that are easy to miss. But again, if we can begin to look for them, I think they're there.
Yeah.
And they can sustain us in those moments of pain or sadness, where we are longing for a better way and trying to imagine what could be next.
Yeah.
And along those lines, it's a question I'd love to ask all of my guests. And so it's sort of a great summary question, but what's the story you want the church to tell?
Mm. I think the story that I would like the church to tell is probably pretty linked to the story that I wish I could probably go back and tell myself at a younger age. So this may be like projecting a lot of things, but I wish I could go. I wish the church would say, like, you don't have to try so hard, that you are loved just as you are. And who you are, your specificity, the way that you are designed within, the intricate details of your life matter. And that God is just inviting us to be with him and to be present, to live into the fullness of who we are, and yet be content with these really small, really beautiful little lives.
Yeah. Love that, to live into the fullness of God's love and to be content with our little lives. Yeah.
Because I think one of the messages that really I struggled with, and it was linked to my belonging as well, was this idea, like it's like this work to prove your worth mentality. And this idea that in order to become more like Christ, I needed to do big things.
Yeah.
That greatness had measurement, that greatness had outcomes, and it looked a particular way.
Yeah.
And I would love to see the church talking more about what this unseen faithfulness really looks like.
I love that. Appreciate that word.
Yeah.
And so then some fun questions as we wrap up, centered around food. So what's one food you refuse to eat?
Soda. Or we call it pop around here in Indiana.
Okay. Yeah.
I am not a soda drinker.
Okay. Fair enough. Is it just soda, or like do you do like bubbly water at times, or is it?
No, I drink like LaCroix, like sparkling water, seltzer waters, all of that. Several years ago, we did that darned Whole30.
Yeah.
And ever since then, I can't really stomach the stuff. Once in a while, I will have a Coke if I have a migraine.
Okay.
Because it's one of the few things that help kind of with that. But otherwise, I can't do it anymore. It's too syrupy, too sweet.
Interesting. Yep. No. Fair enough. Yeah. Then on the other end of the spectrum, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
Oh, goodness. I feel like I talk about these to anyone who asks, but there is a local restaurant here in Fort Wayne called Tolan, and they have these duck fat frites. And it's not just, they're like fancy French fries.
Yeah.
But it's the sauce that you dip them in.
Oh, wow.
That I could just like drink it.
Okay.
It's so good. And I'm always looking for an excuse to go there. And I always, like, if I don't order the duck fat frites, I will walk away with remorse. Like
Remorse.
I should have, like, I knew
Okay.
better. Like,
What
come
is
on, Sarah.
what is the sauce?
It's like it's an aioli, but it has like basil, and it's just really fresh and really garlicky. I'm a big
Okay.
garlic
Yep.
fan.
Okay.
And it's just so good. Probably
is.
horrible for me, so don't tell me about that, but
Yeah.
it's so tasty.
No. Dipping fries in aioli or mayonnaise, like it sounds gross at first, but until you do it, you're like, oh wait, this is revelatory.
Right?
Yeah.
Life-changing. You don't want to go back.
No.
Ketchup.
Ketchup. No. Although I do like, living in Utah, we got exposed to fry sauce.
Okay. Yeah.
I do like fry sauce.
Wait, I don't know this. What is fry sauce?
Fry sauce, it's ubiquitous in Utah. Like wherever you go, you get fry sauce, but it's basically ketchup and mayonnaise mixed together.
Okay, yes. Okay.
In different spices. And so like if I'm making it at home, it's, I usually add some spice or different things, but I do like good fry sauce too.
Okay, yes. I've never heard it called that, but I have
Okay.
had the ketchup mayo conglomeration before.
Awesome. And then finally, there's a conversation among chefs about last meals, as in if you knew you had only had one more meal left to enjoy, what would it be? And so what would be on Sarah's table if she had one last meal to enjoy?
Oh, lots of carbs and lots of cheese. But like the really fancy cheese.
Yep.
I love a good like Stilton with cranberries. I like the fruity soft cheese stuff. A really dry red wine. And then lots of like bread and cracker. I basically want charcuterie.
Yep.
That's what I want.
I understand. Yep. Absolutely.
And then maybe some French fries with the garlic aioli on the
For
side.
Sure. Yes. No, good cheese and wine, it's hard to surpass.
Yes.
Yeah. I had a friend on Facebook ask, like, which would you choose, chips and salsa or cheese and crackers? And I think
cheese and crackers.
Yeah, because it has a higher potential. Like, good cheese, good wine, like you said.
Yeah. I would get tired. I would get tired of the chips and salsa much faster than I would the cheese and crackers.
Yeah. Well, there's just so much great cheese out there. Like,
right?
We are so limited in what cheese could be that we're missing all the beautiful European cheeses and the stinky cheeses and, yeah. The runnier, the better,
all of it. I want all the cheese.
Yep. I understand. Yes. Christmas Eve at our house was cheese and meat and wine.
Yeah.
Just because it meant for easy grazing, coming home from a Christmas Eve service, you could just graze.
Yes. My boys call that snack plates. They want their meal. They want snack plates.
Nice. Yes. Yeah. I understand. Yeah. We usually make one for our girls, and it's not usually what we're eating because we try to get them to try some of the different cheeses, but inevitably they go towards bologna and Kraft singles. But
right.
Now that's fine.
Yeah, I know. We made our boys grilled cheese sandwiches last night, and they got real mad that I didn't do American cheese. Like, how dare I do mild cheddar? And I'm like, okay, y'all need to no.
Yeah.
We're up in our game here.
Yeah, it's time to expand.
Yeah.
No, I understand. Yes. The joys of trying to get our kids to expand while also allowing them to be where they are. Feels like it fits right way with this way of belonging of how do we love them where they're at, but help them push towards something greater.
Right. To embrace maybe a little bit more wider way of experiencing the world.
Exactly.
Yes.
Awesome, Sarah. So this has been such a delight. I appreciate your just genuine heart, your kindness, the gentleness with which you speak of belonging. And listeners, I hope you have gotten a few nuggets. And if people want to learn more about your work, where might they find you?
Probably the easiest place is just to go to my website, which is Sarah with an H, sarahewestfall.com. And from there, you can find my Substack, the podcast, Instagram. Nice. It's kind of like the airport. It'll send out to all the different places from there.
Awesome. So do check out Sarah's website, sarahewestfall.com. And also be sure to read her book, The Way of Belonging, in this year. And just to be challenged and to grow, and how can we be people of belonging. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.